IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, the Takshashila Institution's daily public policy podcast. I'm Anushka Saxena, your host for today and a research analyst at the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And I'm joined by Harshit Sharma, a budding scholar in the West Asia Center at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Hi Harshit, happy to have you here.
Thank you, Anushka. Nice to be here.
Harshit, you work on Iran studies, domestic politics, the nuclear question, and you spend a lot of time trying to understand the US-Iran equation when it comes to the nuclear question and nuclear geopolitics, right? And in the past week, we've seen a very interesting development, which is that the US and Iran have come to a conclusion to swap prisoners between the two countries, with America releasing 5 jailed Iranians in exchange for Iran releasing 5 jailed Americans. And the flying news is that this happened at the end of 2 years of quiet back-channel talks. So just to begin with, Harshit, can you give our listeners a little bit of insight from what you know, what these back-channel talks were, where did they happen, and what do you think potential other topics of discussion were?
So the back-channel talks you mentioned that were going on for the last 2 years, mediated by Oman in particular, they were not really about the prisoner swap that we saw recently. They were mostly about to revive the nuclear deal. As we all know that in the Trump administration, US withdrew from the deal unilaterally in 2018. So the back-channel talks were mostly about the nuclear negotiations. But due to a few impediments that we'll discuss later in the podcast, it couldn't happen. And it's very unlikely that we'll see a deal in the near future. So some analysts argue that this prisoner swap, as we know, where US is releasing 5 Iranian prisoners and Iran is doing the same, and 4 of them have already been transferred from jail to house arrest in Iran. So it's just a policy of less for less, because in both the countries, the national elections are approaching very soon. So it's about that.
Okay. And what other things were discussed in the deal? I think there was something about funds being released on issues that are not under sanctions from the US. Can you tell us about that?
So apart from the prisoner swap, the US and Europe, they've allowed South Korea to release $6 billion to Iran, but they are not exactly going to be transferred to Iran, but rather they'll be transferred to Qatar, so that the government of Qatar can keep an eye as to how the funds are being used. They're supposed to primarily be used only for medical and other humanitarian purposes, which do not come under sanctions. And the funds will only be released once the American prisoners who are in Iran right now will be out of the Iranian airspace.
Okay. And what has been the sentiment on the two sides with regards to the back-channel talks? Have any of the governments released any statements? Have they said the developments are positive or something of the sort?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Neither of the countries, US or Iran, have formally said that they are talking about nuclear deal. In fact, US even did not recognize that there were back-channel talks that were going on. Even though Iran, the official spokesperson of Iran, has said that yes, the back-channel talks were going on in Oman, where in the capital city, the US as well as Iranian counterparts, they were living in different hotels, and the Omanis were going from one hotel to another, and the meetings were going on in this manner. But neither of them has said anything. The US, like time and again, has said that they will open all the options with regards to Iran going nuclear. Iran just yesterday has released a statement that they prefer the diplomatic means to solve the Iranian nuclear crisis. But the main issue is lack of trust from both the sides.
So, I mean, I think I just read this as well, that Iran's deputy foreign minister and the person who's usually in charge of nuclear negotiations, Ali Bagheri Kani, he also said that Iran has received quote unquote commitments necessary from the United States that it would honor the deal with regards to the exchange of prisoners and the release of Iran's billions of dollars in assets, right? So it's interesting that you mentioned that neither of the countries has kind of officially recognized that talks were happening on the back channel about the nuclear question with regards to Iran. And you also said that there are some impediments which will not let the nuclear deal happen anytime soon or in the near future. So your work is mostly revolving around Iran, right? So let's go to Iran first. What do you think are the impediments or the hindrances the Iran government or any other stakeholders in Iran are facing when it comes to actualizing a nuclear deal? I mean, of course, there were problems that they had with the provisions of the JCPOA, and that's at the face of it. But any other insights from you?
Well, I think there are three main issues which are an impediment in Iran. First of all, there's a problem of who to talk to negotiate. Even though the Supreme National Security Council, the SNSC, has been given the task to the nuclear negotiations, but even then, if they are convinced or whatever has been talked inside the room between US and other P5+1 countries with Iran, it doesn't matter so much because ultimately the important foreign policy matters, including this nuclear matter, it depends on the supreme jurisconsult, that is Ali Khamenei right now. So this is the main problem: who to go to and whom to talk with, and whatever has been discussed, will it really be implemented or not? The second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, lack of trust. After the Trump administration withdrew from the deal unilaterally in 2018, the Iranians have increased uranium enrichment, according to many reports. Now, if the Iranians want to again start following whatever has been mentioned in the deal, they want some kind of assurance from their American counterpart that they will not withdraw from the deal again. Even though the Biden administration is keen to revive the nuclear deal, but since even they don't know what will happen in the next elections and who will come to power and whether they will follow the deal, whatever has been mentioned in the deal. So it is this US's unwillingness to assure Iran that is one of the impediments from that Iran is facing. But the third impediment, which has been less talked about and which I think is the key impediment in revival of the nuclear deal, is that after the US Trump administration withdrew from the deal in 2018, they also designated the IRGC as the foreign terrorist organization. And this is, by the way, for the first time that the US has designated an organization as an FTO that is officially a part of any government that is recognized by the United Nations. Since IRGC controls almost one third of the Iranian economy and reports directly to Ali Khamenei rather than the president, unprecedented power in Iran. And even though, as I mentioned earlier, that the SNSC has been tasked with nuclear negotiations, it's very interesting to note that 4 out of 5 secretaries of the SNSC have had background in the IRGC. And even recently, who heads the SNSC is again from the IRGC. So it's matter of prestige for the Iranians that a part of their official military, the elite military, has been designated as an FTO. And the IRGC happens to be in a unique position to influence the nuclear talks. That's why I'm of the opinion that if the US really prioritizes to revive the nuclear deal, it is very important for the US to be more flexible with this designation.
Right. And just out of curiosity, has the IRGC also been involved in previous nuclear negotiations? Were there representatives in the room when, for example, the JCPOA was being negotiated?
Never. The IRGC has never been part of any formal nuclear, meetings. But even the Supreme Jurisconsult Ali Khamenei has never been a part of the nuclear negotiations. It doesn't mean that he doesn't matter. So they've never been officially any part of the nuclear deal. But as I mentioned earlier, they control one third of the Iranian economy. And it's not like they report to the president who is elected by the general population. They report directly to Ali Khamenei. And Ali Khamenei has never been very keen to revive the nuclear deal for various reasons I can go into if you want. But this is the thing. When the US designated IRGC as an FTO, I am of the opinion that they did not think it's much of an issue. And frankly speaking, the designation doesn't work much because it just means that any personnel of the IRGC cannot travel to the US. Now, the thing is, and this has been said by Anthony Blinken too, that any major personnel of the IGC is never going to visit US anyway. So what's the point of this? And it's the IRGC's Quds Force which has been assigned to carry out the revolution outside the territory of Iran, which is the problem. One of the other reason why they designated the IRGC as an FTO is that the IRGC has allegedly killed some US citizens in Iraq. But the thing is, IRGC Quds Force is only a very small part of the IRGC. So it makes sense if the US only designates the Quds Force as an FTO rather than the whole of the organization. And I think that this may be a positive step which can, play as an important role to progress the stalled nuclear talks.
Absolutely, that makes sense. And as you mentioned, apart from having control over 1/3 of the Iranian economy, members of the IRGC are also in some of the key senior positions in, say, the SNC, for example, and they are the ones who will ultimately be in the room. And so that influence kind of extends above and beyond. But yes, I would actually happy to hear, and so will our listeners, about your thoughts on why Ali Khamenei indeed does not want the nuclear deal to go through, because I think that could also have some insights as to the larger impediments that Iran is currently facing in reviving the stalled nuclear talks.
According to Karim Sajjanpur, Ali Khamenei's worldview has been majorly shaped by what has happened during the revolution. Ali Khamenei saw what happened when the Shah gave in to the population's will. Another factor is what happened with the USSR in 1989. Ali Khamenei is of the opinion that any concession, and that also includes the hijab matter that is going on in Iran right now, any concession will ultimately lead to the demise of the Islamic Republic. And negotiating with the quote unquote the great Satan is giving in to what should be the right of the Iranian Republic. They have never said that they want a nuclear weapon, and they are a part of they have signed the NPT as well. So recently, Ali Khamenei also said that he is willing to let the Iranian government negotiate with the United States, but the nuclear infrastructure should remain intact. Now, this means something. It can be interpreted that he's saying that however, to whichever level the uranium has been enriched, we should not give it away like we did earlier. So, as we saw in 2018, Ali Khamenei has been proven right, as he says that the United States cannot be trusted. And when the United States withdrew from the deal unilaterally, he was proven right that they should not be trusted, and they should not be trusted again.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Right. And so that brings us to the United States. There has been a lot of will expressed by the US, first in the form of the JCPOA, and then with Biden's comments with regards to how important it is to get Iran in the room and have an answer to the nuclear question, about ultimately resolving the issue of why or not Iran should go nuclear. So in that context, what hindrances do you think the US is facing in actually reviving the stalled nuclear negotiations or actually making another deal happen?
As I said earlier, that the Biden administration is keen to revive the nuclear deal, but has been unable to do so, and has been again unable to bring the Iranians on the same page. Now, to understand this, we need to go back to the issue of the difference in opinion between the Republicans and the Democrats with regards to Iran. There are two major lobbies in US. First is Kissinger's lobby, who think that we should prioritize Israel's interest. They are the chief, US. They serve the US's interests in the region primarily. And they are of the opinion that, as we have heard the term of maximum pressure, they believe that Iran can only be tackled and should only be tackled by the policy of maximum pressure. On the other hand, there is Brzezinski's lobby, who are of the opinion that Iran should be considered a pivot state to keep away the Chinese and Russians from the Middle East as well as the Caucasus. After the Biden administration came to power, the Brzezinski's lobby came into prominence. But even then, they have been unable to do so, to revive the deal. Now, the thing is, the Congress from the US side is arguably the biggest impediment to the revival of the nuclear deal. And by the way, they are for a deal which will stop Iran from going nuclear, but they do not support the deal which happened during the Obama's administration, in which there was only certain time period the Iranians were being stopped from developing a nuclear weapon, and until then all the funds, assets, money will be provided to Iran, which Iran will allegedly use to sponsor different terrorist organization in the region. Many congressmen have written to the president that any deal which they will have with the Iranians will have to go through the Congress. And this entails that the deal will not happen because they will not allow it. The other reason, arguably, is that Israel doesn't want the US to revive the nuclear deal. And as we all know, that Israel has a very strong lobby in the US's foreign policy making. Why Israel doesn't want it, there are different reasons for it, but they largely overlap with the Kissinger's lobby.
Okay. And apart from the arguments that the Kissinger lobby gives in the US elite decision making, what other reasons are kind of stopping Israel from letting Iran go nuclear? I mean, of course, there is a regional security cost to the issue, but anything in specific that has to do with the Israel-Iran relationship?
Israel is of the opinion that the deal that the Obama administration came up with will not stop the Iran from going nuclear. And the deal also states that only for a certain period, for instance, in October 2023, after October 2023, the Iranians will be allowed to develop some missiles, which they cannot until October. And similarly, after, I think, 2030, the Iranians will be allowed to even enrich uranium to whatever extent they want. So the Israelis believe that first, the deal did not stop the Iranians from going nuclear. Second, the deal means that whatever sanctions there are on Iran will be lifted, which means Iran will be in possession of, assets and funds and money and whatnot, which will be used to sponsor terrorism in the region. And many Iranian prominent politicians in Iran have said time and again that they want to wipe off from the face of the earth. So the Israelis want that until the Iranians agree to a deal which will stop them from going nuclear at any point in history, until then, there should be no deal, because a bad deal is worse than no deal.
Right. That's interesting. And Harshit, I have one final question for you. It seems you're going to be visiting Iran later this year at the end of September. And 16th September, incidentally, is also the anniversary of the Mahsa Amini protest that started last year with regards to the right of wearing or not wearing the hijab in Iran, right? So what do you think are the prospects of those protests kickstarting again? And do you think the domestic apparatus is now ready to kind of handle them or suppress them with more force?
Months into the protests, the Iranian regime withdrew the morality police from the streets and instead set up, very good surveillance system to monitor whether the hijab rule is being followed or not. Only within the last 2 to 3 months, almost 5 million messages have been sent to women not wearing hijab, even inside the car. But in the last month, in mid-July, the morality police, or Gasht-e-Irshad as they call it in Iran, has been redeployed in the streets of Iran. It probably may have been done because the Iranian regime must have foreseen that the protests are going to resume again on the anniversary. So it's for all of us to see that whether the Iranian regime will be able to control the protests or not. But it's extremely likely that the Gen Z will be pouring out in the streets against the hijab mandate.
Right. With that note, thank you so much, Harshit, for your insights. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.